The air in the Patriot Arms indoor range hung thick with the metallic tang of burnt gunpowder and the sharp, clean scent of CLP gun oil. It was a modern cathedral of noise and precision, where sleek, black rifles mounted with expensive optics spat fire and lead into paper effigies. In Lane 7, however, there was a stark anachronism. An old man, his back stooped with the weight of 82 years, stood with a rifle that seemed as ancient as he was. It was a thing of polished walnut and blued steel, a relic from an era before polymer and Picatinny rails. His name was Roy Brooks. His hands, though wrinkled and mapped with liver spots, were steady. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a placid stillness that seemed alien in this environment of contained violence. He wore a simple flannel shirt and a faded canvas shooting jacket, its elbows worn smooth from decades of use. Lane 7, clear your weapon. Clear your weapon and step back from the line. The voice that boomed over the intercom was young, arrogant, and dripping with impatience. It belonged to Kyle, the range safety officer, a man barely in his mid-20s who carried himself with the unearned confidence of someone who had watched a lot of action movies. Roy did as he was told. His movements were slow, deliberate, and economical. He laid the vintage Winchester Model 70 on the bench, opened the bolt, and visually and physically inspected the chamber. He did it without looking, his fingers knowing the geography of the rifle by heart. He then placed a small, yellow empty chamber indicator into the breech and stepped back. Kyle swaggered over, clipboard in hand. He was clad in tactical pants and a tight-fitting polo shirt that strained to contain his gym-sculpted physique. On his hip was a polymer pistol in a tactical holster, an accessory he wore like a piece of jewelry. He tapped a button on the control panel, and the target carrier from Lane 7 began its electric whine, reeling back towards them. "Let's see what we've got this time, old-timer," Kyle said, his voice loud enough for the shooters in the adjacent lanes to hear. "Maybe you grazed it this time, eh?" The target, a standard B-27 silhouette, arrived and stopped. It was pristine. Not a single hole marred its surface. The black outline of the man-shaped target was untouched. The scoring rings were perfect. The paper was as clean as it had been when it was first clipped to the holder. A few of the other shooters paused, glancing over. A quiet snicker rippled from Lane 5. Kyle let out a theatrical sigh. "Mr. Brooks, we've been over this. You need to actually hit the paper. This is 10 shots. 10. And not one of them is on here. Are you even aiming? Or are you just closing your eyes and hoping for the best?" Roy Brooks said nothing. He simply looked at the clean target, his expression unreadable. His silence was a canvas onto which Kyle could paint any inadequacy he wished. To the young instructor, it was the silence of senility, of confusion, of shame. He couldn't have been more wrong. Inside Roy's mind, there was no shame. There was only a calm, quiet space where he analyzed the variables. He felt the subtle hum of the building's ventilation system through the soles of his worn leather boots. He noted the way the fluorescent lights cast no discernible shadow on the front sight post. He was aware of his own heartbeat, a slow, steady rhythm like a metronome. He was not shooting at paper. He never was. "Look," Kyle said, adopting a tone of patronizing pity. "Maybe this isn't for you anymore. No shame in it. Eyes get old. Hands get shaky. Maybe it's time to hang up the old rifle, huh?" He patted Roy's shoulder in a gesture that was meant to seem kind but was purely performative, an act of dominance. The whispers started to circulate among the other shooters, quiet comments exchanged behind cupped hands. They saw an old man, frail and possibly confused, being coddled by a range officer. They saw a liability. They saw a reason their range fees might go up. They didn't see the men who had once lain motionless in a jungle swamp for 3 days, becoming part of the landscape, waiting for a single, perfect shot. Roy finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I'll try again." Kyle rolled his eyes. "Fine. 1 more magazine. 5 rounds. If you can't put a single hole in the paper, you're done for the day. I can't have you flinging lead all over my range." "It's a safety issue." He unclipped the perfect target and slapped a fresh one onto the carrier, hitting the button to send it zipping back down to the 50-yard line. Roy turned back to his rifle. He ignored the stares. He ignored the pity and the scorn. He had endured worse. He had endured the sucking mud of the Mekong Delta, the silent terror of a listening post at midnight, the weight of a friend dying in his arms. The judgment of a preening boy in a clean, air-conditioned room was less than nothing. It was just noise. And Roy was an expert at filtering out noise. The campaign of harassment had begun the moment Roy had walked in. Kyle had eyed the wooden rifle case with disdain, a stark contrast to the tactical Pelican cases and drag bags the other patrons carried. "What VE you got in there, Grandpa?" "A musket," he had quipped, earning a few chuckles from the regulars. When Roy had unlatched the case, revealing the classic lines of the heavily modified Winchester, Kyle had scoffed. "A bolt action. No scope. You're using iron sights? Seriously?" "It has a scope," Roy had said quietly, pointing to the long, slender unertl optic mounted on the barrel, a design that predated Kyle's parents. "It's an external adjustment scope." "Right. Whatever," Kyle had muttered, his ignorance on full display. "Just try to keep M on the paper." From that point on, Kyle had made Roy his personal project. He hovered behind Lane 7, offering a relentless stream of unsolicited and incorrect advice. "You gotta get a better cheek weld, old man. Really press into it." Roy's cheek was barely touching the stock, a floating weld he had perfected over half a century to mitigate parallax and vibration. "Squeeze the trigger, don't jerk it." "Nice and easy," Kyle coached, as if speaking to a child. Roy's finger was applying pressure so smoothly and consistently that the break of the trigger was a surprise even to him, exactly as it should be. With every missed target, Kyle's condescension grew. He started calling out to the other shooters. "Hey fellas, check this out. Mr. Brooks here is trying to shoot the numbers off the lane markers." He held up another clean sheet of paper. "He's a pacifist. Doesn't want to hurt the paper." The taunts served their purpose. They built a wall around Roy, isolating him from the rest of the group. Other shooters, who might have otherwise been curious about his vintage rifle, now kept their distance. They didn't want to be associated with the struggling old man. They didn't want to become the next target of Kyle's abrasive humor. Some even felt a flicker of resentment towards Roy, as if his perceived incompetence was somehow a personal inconvenience, a disruption to their serious training. "Maybe you should try the .22 range," another shooter suggested, trying to be helpful but only adding another layer to the humiliation. "The recoil is a lot more manageable." Roy just nodded, absorbing it all. His face remained a placid mask. This unnerving calm was the most infuriating thing to Kyle. He wanted a reaction. He wanted frustration, anger, embarrassment. He wanted the old man to give up, to pack his ancient rifle and shuffle out the door, validating Kyle's assessment of him as a relic who didn't belong. But Roy did not break. He did not waver. He simply reloaded. Each movement was a study in practiced efficiency. He'd pull a cartridge from the small, waxed paper box on the bench. The rounds were hand loads, the brass polished to a soft gleam, the bullets seated with micrometer precision. He would chamber the round, close the bolt with a quiet, solid click, and settle back into his stance. He would breathe in, then out, then half out, finding the natural respiratory pause. His world would shrink to the circular image in the unertl scope. He would see the target, not as a piece of paper, but as a problem of physics. An equation of windage, elevation, and time. Then he would let the shot happen, a moment of perfect stillness in a sea of noise. The rifle would bark, a sharp, authoritative crack that was deeper and more resonant than the snappy reports of the AR-15s around him. The rifle would push back against his shoulder, a familiar and comforting shove. He would work the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, which would land in a neat little pile beside his foot. And then he would do it all over again. He was not just shooting. He was performing a ritual, a meditation he had practiced in jungles and mountains, in heat and in cold, for longer than anyone here had been alive. And this ritual, this unbreakable discipline, was driving his tormentor mad. Kyle couldn't comprehend it. In his world, performance was everything. If you weren't getting results, holes in the paper, then you were failing. This old man was failing spectacularly, yet he showed no signs of it. He just kept going, his calm a silent rebuke to Kyle's authority. The battle for Lane 7 had become a battle for Kyle's own ego. 3 lanes down, a man named David was cleaning his SIG sour pistol. He was in his late 30s, with the quiet intensity of someone who had spent time in uniform. A small, faded eagle, globe, and anchor tattoo was visible on his forearm. He was a former Marine sergeant, and he had been watching the drama in Lane 7 with growing unease. At first, he had felt the same flicker of annoyance as the others. An old guy who couldn't hit the broad side of a barn was a safety concern. But then he started to watch Roy, not just his results. David had been trained to observe, to see details others missed. And the details in Lane 7 didn't add up. He saw the way Roy handled his rifle. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. Every action was smooth, ingrained by countless repetitions. It was the kind of weapon familiarity that only came from one thing, a lifetime of practice. An old man with dementia didn't move like that. He saw the rifle itself. He didn't recognize the scope, but he knew the action. It was a pre-1964 Winchester Model 70, the rifleman's rifle. The barrel was heavy, free-floated. The stock was custom-fitted, the wood dark with age and oil from a man's hands. This wasn't a dusty heirloom pulled from a closet. It was a serious tool, meticulously maintained. He noticed Roy's stance. It was unorthodox by modern standards, but it was rock solid. His feet were perfectly placed, his weight balanced. Most importantly, David watched Roy's breathing. He saw the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, the telltale pause before each shot. That was the breathing control of a highly trained marksman. You could teach a novice to stand correctly, but you couldn't teach that kind of physiological control overnight. The contradiction was baffling. Here was a man who exhibited all the fundamentals of an expert shooter, yet he was apparently incapable of hitting a man-sized target at 50 yards. It was like watching a concert pianist play a child's nursery rhyme with all the wrong notes. It just didn't make sense. During the next ceasefire, while Kyle was busy berating Roy again, David decided to act on his curiosity. He walked over to Lane 7, keeping his demeanor casual. "That's a beautiful piece of history you've got there," he said, nodding toward the Winchester. Roy turned his pale blue eyes on him. They were clear and sharp, not clouded with the confusion David had expected. "Thank you," Roy said simply. "Model 70, isn't it? Pre-64 action?" David asked, showing a bit of his own knowledge. A flicker of something, perhaps appreciation, crossed Roy's face. "It is. Been with me a long time. Mind if I ask what you're shooting?" David gestured to the box of ammunition on the bench. "Factory loads." "Hand loads," Roy replied. 175 grain Sierra Match King. Pushing about 2,600 feet per second. David's eyebrows shot up. That was a serious, high-precision load. It was the gold standard for long-range accuracy. It was absolute overkill for a 50-yard indoor range. It was the kind of ammunition you used when you wanted to put a bullet exactly where you wanted it, every single time. Using that ammunition and missing a B-27 target was like using a surgical laser to miss a barn door. The pieces were clicking into place, but the final picture was still unclear. David looked from the pristine target on the carrier to the box of match-grade ammunition, then to the calm old man and his classic rifle. The inconsistency was screaming at him. He was missing something. There was a variable he hadn't accounted for. "You served?" David asked quietly, seeing the distant look in the old man's eyes. "A long time ago," Roy said, his voice softer now. "Different world." "Marine Corps, here," David said, tapping his forearm tattoo. "Just got out a few years ago." Roy nodded slowly. "Good man. Thank you for your service." "You too, sir," David replied instinctively, the "sir" coming out without thought. There was an aura of quiet authority around this man that the young range officer was completely blind to. The ceasefire ended, and David walked back to his lane, his mind racing. He was no longer just an observer. He was invested. He had a strong suspicion that everyone at this range was witnessing something extraordinary, but they were all too busy looking at the wrong thing. They were all looking at the target. David decided he was going to watch the man. Kyle, his patience finally exhausted and his ego demanding a public execution, decided it was time to end the charade. He strode to the center of the firing line, raised his voice to command the attention of the entire range, and pointed a dramatic finger at lane 7. "All right, folks, listen up," he announced. "We're going to settle this. A little test. A final exam, you could say." He walked over to a supply cabinet and pulled out a sheet of small, adhesive dots. He peeled off a single black dot, no bigger than a dime, and held it up for everyone to see. 1 dot. 1 inch. He marched down to Roy's lane and clipped on a fresh, clean target. He then strode to the very center of the paper and pressed the tiny black dot firmly onto the X-ring. He stepped back, admiring his work as if he were an artist. "Here's the deal, Mr. Brooks," Kyle declared, his voice ringing with theatrical finality. The entire range had gone quiet. All the other shooters had stopped, their weapons benched, turning to watch the drama unfold. 5 shots. All you have to do is hit the paper. Just 1 hole. Anywhere on this big, beautiful piece of paper. You do that, and you can shoot all day. You fail. And you're done. For good. I'm revoking your range membership for safety violations. My range, my rules. The threat was absurd, a complete abuse of his minor authority, but Kyle was too caught up in the moment to care. He was the ringmaster, and this was his show. He was going to publicly break the stubborn old man and reassert his dominance. David, watching from his lane, felt a knot of anger tighten in his stomach. This wasn't about safety anymore. This was a cruel, public humiliation. It was a bully picking a target he thought was weak. He almost stepped forward to intervene, to tell Kyle to back off, but something stopped him. It was Roy's face. The old man looked at Kyle, then at the target with the tiny black dot 50 yards away. There was no fear in his eyes. No anger. No hint of surrender. Instead, for the first time that day, David saw a flicker of something else in the depths of those pale blue eyes. It was a faint, cold spark of focus. The placid calm was gone, replaced by an intensity that was startling. It was the look of a predator that had finally decided to acknowledge the annoying fly buzzing around its head. Roy Brooks turned to his bench. He did not protest the unfairness of the challenge. He did not argue the stakes. He simply accepted. He picked up 5 of his hand-loaded cartridges. He slid them, one by one, into the rifle's internal magazine, pressing them down with his thumb until they clicked into place. The sound was crisp and sharp in the heavy silence that had fallen over the range. He closed the bolt, chambering the first round. Then he settled into his stance. He became part of the rifle. His breathing slowed, his body became utterly still. The entire universe seemed to contract, focusing down to the men, the rifle, and the tiny black dot 50 yards away. The onlookers, even Kyle, felt a sudden, inexplicable tension in the air. The mood had shifted from pity to a kind of breathless anticipation. They didn't know what they were about to see, but they knew the show was about to begin. The first shot shattered the silence. Crack. The report of the Winchester was deafening in the expectant hush. Roy worked the bolt with fluid precision. The brass casing spun through the air, a glint of gold, and landed with a soft tink on the floor. He chambered the next round. He didn't rush. He didn't pause. He was a machine built for this one purpose. Crack. The second shot followed the first. The bolt cycled again. Eject. Chamber. Settle. Crack. Third shot. The rhythm was hypnotic. It was the cadence of pure, undiluted skill. Breath. Squeeze. Report. Cycle. Crack. Fourth shot. Kyle's smug grin had vanished, replaced by a look of confusion. He was watching the target through a pair of binoculars and saw nothing. No new holes appearing on the paper. Nothing. Crack. The fifth and final shot echoed through the range. Roy held his follow-through for a long second, then slowly relaxed. He opened the bolt on an empty chamber, cleared the weapon, and placed it gently on the bench. He stepped back from the line and waited, his face as impassive as ever. The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the room was fixed on the target carrier in lane 7. Kyle, regaining his composure, forced a laugh. It sounded hollow and strained. Well, folks. There you have it. A perfect 5 for 5. Misses, he announced, trying to reclaim control of the narrative. That settles it. Time to pack it up, old man. Thanks for the demonstration. He swaggered to the control panel and smugly pressed the retrieve button. The electric motor whirred to life, pulling the target back towards the firing line. As it drew closer, the crowd leaned in, craning their necks to see the result. The paper came into view, sliding under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was completely, utterly, spotlessly clean. There was no hole from the first shot. Or the second. Or any of the 5. The tiny black dot in the center remained untouched, a mocking black eye in a sea of white. A wave of murmurs washed over the onlookers. It was a mix of disappointment, pity, and a sort of second-hand embarrassment for the old man. Kyle's grin returned, wider and more triumphant than ever. As I said, he gloated, not a single hit. Membership revoked. Please pack your things and... wait. The voice was quiet but firm. It came from David, the former Marine. He had stepped forward from his lane, his arms crossed, his eyes narrowed not at the target, but at the target holder. What did you say? Kyle snapped, annoyed by the interruption. I said wait, David repeated, his voice harder this time. You're looking at the wrong thing. Check the backing board. Check the wall. Kyle scoffed. Check the wall. What for? Ricochets. The old guy is missing the paper, not, his voice trailed off as a seed of doubt was planted. He glanced at the range master, an older, more experienced man named Frank, who had been watching the proceedings with a weary expression. Frank shrugged, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Annoyed but compelled by the public challenge to his authority, Kyle grabbed a powerful flashlight from the main desk. He and Frank walked down the now silent lane, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. They reached the target stop. Kyle held up the paper target again for all to see, showing its perfect, unmarred surface, as if to say, see. I was right. Then, following David's instruction, he removed the paper. He shined the flashlight on the thick, black, self-healing rubber block that served as the backing board. And there it was. In the exact center of the board, precisely where the little black dot had been, was a single hole. It was small, ragged, and no bigger than a dime. A stunned silence fell over the range. Kyle stared at the hole, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. One hole. But there were 5 shots. It made no sense. Frank, the range master, understood immediately. His eyes went wide. He gently pushed Kyle aside and leaned in closer, aiming the flashlight beam directly into the tiny opening. He peered into the dark void for a long moment, then slowly straightened up. He turned his head and looked back down the 50-yard stretch of concrete and steel, his gaze landing on the calm, silent figure of Roy Brooks. The look on Frank's face was one of pure, unadulterated awe. "Oh my God," Frank whispered, his voice hoarse. He turned to the now pale Kyle. "Get down here. Look." Hesitantly, Kyle leaned down and peered into the hole. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness of the rubber block and illuminated the thick, reinforced concrete wall of the range's backstop. And there, embedded in the gray concrete, was the unmistakable glint of lead. Not one piece, but 5 flattened pieces of lead, stacked and fused together in a single, jagged crater, a group so impossibly tight it could be completely covered by a thumbnail. He hadn't missed. He hadn't even just hit the target. Roy Brooks had placed 5 175-grain, match-grade bullets through the exact same hole, from 50 yards away, with a vintage rifle using iron sights. A feat of marksmanship so profound, so utterly beyond the comprehension of anyone in that room, that it bordered on the supernatural. The paper was clean because the first bullet had created a perfect, tiny channel, and the subsequent 4 bullets had followed it precisely, like a train on a track, never once touching the surrounding paper. The realization washed over the onlookers in a wave of silent shock. The whispers stopped. The snickering died. All that remained was a stunned, gaping silence. The scorn and pity they had felt just moments before evaporated, replaced by a feeling of profound, humbling awe. They had not been watching a failure. They had been witnessing a masterclass, and had been too blind to see it. At that exact moment, as if summoned by the revelation itself, the main door to the range swung open with a pneumatic hiss, letting in a slice of bright afternoon sunlight. Framed in the doorway stood a figure that commanded instant and absolute attention. He was a man in his late 50s, tall and ramrod straight, wearing the immaculate Class A uniform of a full colonel in the United States Army. His chest was a rainbow of service ribbons, and the silver eagle on his shoulder gleamed under the range lights. He scanned the room, his sharp eyes passing over the assembled shooters, over the pale-faced Kyle, landing finally on the old man in the faded flannel shirt. A look of deep, profound respect softened the colonel's stern features. He strode forward, his polished shoes clicking on the concrete floor, his path taking him directly to Lane 7. He ignored everyone else as if they were merely part of the furniture. "Mr. Brooks," the colonel said, his voice a low baritone that carried easily across the silent room. He came to a halt in front of Roy and executed a perfectly crisp salute. "It is an absolute honor to meet you, sir." Roy, looking slightly surprised by the interruption, returned a slow, tired nod. Kyle, his mind still reeling from the discovery at the backstop, saw the colonel and his programming kicked in. He was an authority figure. He had to take charge. He scrambled back from the target line, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Colonel, sir. Welcome to Patriot Arms," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I'm Kyle, the range safety officer. I'm sorry for the interruption, but I was just in the process of removing this man for." The colonel didn't even turn his head. He cut Kyle off with a single, icy glare. It was a look forged in command tense and hostile territories, a look that conveyed more authority and menace than 1,000 shouted words. Kyle's mouth snapped shut with an audible click. "I know who you are," the colonel said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "And I know what you were doing." He turned his full attention to the young instructor, and Kyle felt himself shrink under the weight of that gaze. "I'm looking for Sergeant Major Roy Brooks. Are you telling me you were removing him from this facility?" The name hung in the air. Sergeant Major. A rank of immense respect, earned through decades of service. Kyle paled, his face turning the color of ash. "Sergeant Major," he squeaked. The colonel held up a leather-bound portfolio he was carrying. He opened it, revealing a formal document adorned with an official seal. "I am here on behalf of the Secretary of the Army to speak with Sergeant Major Roy Brooks, Medal of Honor recipient." A collective gasp went through the room. Medal of Honor. The highest, most sacred award for valor. It was a name spoken in hushed, reverent tones. The colonel's eyes bored into Kyle. The men credited by the 1st Air Cavalry Division with what is officially logged as the miracle at Ia Drang, a confirmed 1,200-yard shot, in the middle of a monsoon, firing through a triple canopy jungle, at a moving target, to neutralize an enemy commander and save the lives of all 32 men in 3rd Platoon, Alpha Company. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the stunned silence. He then read directly from the citation in his hand, his voice ringing with the formal, hallowed language of military history. The citation notes, the colonel continued, his eyes locking with Kyle's, that Sergeant Major Brooks's shot was so precise, so impossibly placed, that it was initially recorded by his spotter as a clean miss until the platoon was able to advance and physically recover the target hours later. They found the enemy commander dead, with a single, perfect bullet hole through his field radio's antenna, the round having then passed through him. He didn't even disturb the leaves on the bushes around him. The colonel closed the portfolio with a sharp snap. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent range. "You were removing this man." "For what, son?" he asked, his voice now a blade of ice. "For missing the paper." Kyle stood frozen, his face a mask of pure horror. The situational irony was so thick, so crushing, it was almost poetic. He had spent the entire day mocking a living legend for demonstrating the very skill that had made him a hero, a skill so advanced that Kyle's limited mind was incapable of even conceiving it, let alone recognizing it. His arrogance had led him to this moment of absolute, public, and catastrophic self-destruction. The owner of the range, a portly man named Mr. Henderson, who had been drawn out of his office by the commotion, rushed forward, his face slick with sweat. "Colonel, I am so sorry. This is a terrible misunderstanding. Kyle is new, he." The colonel held up a single hand, silencing him. "There is no misunderstanding here, Mr. Henderson. I have been watching your range's security feed from my car for the last 30 minutes, waiting for Mr. Brooks to finish his practice. I have witnessed gross incompetence, a flagrant abuse of authority, and a level of disrespect that I find frankly breathtaking." He turned his gaze back to Kyle, who looked as if he was about to collapse. "You are a disgrace. You have no business wearing a uniform of any kind, let alone supervising others with firearms. You are a liability. And you are an embarrassment to every decent man and woman who has ever served this country. As of this moment, you are fired. Pack your things and get off this property. If I ever see you near a military installation or a veteran again, I will personally ensure your life becomes exceptionally difficult." He spoke with the flat, emotionless finality of a judge passing sentence. There was no appeal. Kyle's career, his ego, his entire self-image, had just been dismantled in front of 24 witnesses. Without a word, his face ashen, Kyle turned and shuffled toward the employee locker room, a ghost in tactical pants. With the unpleasantness dispatched, the colonel's entire demeanor changed. He turned back to Roy, and the hard lines on his face softened into a warm, genuine smile. "Sergeant Major," he said, his voice filled with respect. "I apologize for that display. No hero should ever be treated that way." Roy gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "He was just a boy, Colonel. Loud, but harmless." The colonel chuckled. "You are a more gracious man than I, Sergeant Major. The Secretary of the Army sends his personal regards. He was hoping you might reconsider his offer. The new generation of scout snipers at Fort Benning are about to begin their final phase of training. They've read the manuals, they've passed the tests. But they lack context. They need to learn from someone who was there. They need to learn from the best there ever was." For the first time that day, a genuine smile touched Roy's lips. It was a small thing, but it transformed his weathered face, chasing away the years. "I suppose I could show them a thing or two," he said. The spell that had held the other shooters in place finally broke. They stirred, looking at each other with wide, disbelieving eyes. They had just been granted a front-row seat to a piece of living history. The quiet old man they had mocked was a giant, a figure of legend. David, the former Marine, was the first to move. He walked forward, his posture straight, his heels clicking together as he came to a position of attention before Roy. He extended his hand. "Sergeant Major Brooks," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was a profound honor to watch you shoot. Thank you for your service to our country." Roy took his hand, his grip surprisingly firm. "Good to see the Corps is still making fine men, Sergeant." One by one, the other shooters approached. They offered handshakes, quiet words of apology, and expressions of awe. The scorn had been burned away, replaced by a deep, abiding respect. They helped Roy pack his gear, handling the old Winchester rifle with a newfound reverence, as if it were a holy relic. They cleared his brass, wiped down his bench, and treated him with the deference due to a king. As Roy and the colonel prepared to leave, Frank, the range master, brought the target from Lane 7 over. The paper was still pristine, but now, in the center, was the single, tiny, ragged hole in the rubber backing board, a dark star of impossible perfection. "Mr. Brooks. I mean, Sergeant Major," Frank stammered. Would you consider signing this for us? We'd like to frame it. To hang it in the lobby. As a reminder. A reminder of what true skill looked like. A reminder that heroes walk among us, often in the quietest, most unassuming forms. A reminder that arrogance is blind, and that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most important. Roy took the pen Frank offered and, in a neat, practiced script, signed his name beside the whole, Roy Brooks, SGM, U.S. Army, Ret. He and the colonel walked out into the bright sunshine, leaving behind a room full of humbled and inspired men. They left behind the lingering smell of gunpowder and the ghost of a young man's shattered ego. The final image for those inside was the target, a testament not to what was hit, but to what was transcended. The legend was not just real, he had just finished his practice for the day. And a new generation of soldiers was about to learn what true marksmanship really meant.